I've been reading through what Australia's foreign minister is about to say in Manila, and there's one line buried in it that China does not want you to hear. Let me walk you through exactly what's about to happen. Before I get into it, drop a comment and tell me what country you're watching from. I go through them after every video, and it genuinely helps me know who I'm talking to out there. So Penny Wong, Australia's foreign minister, she's about to step up to a podium in Manila, Philippines. ASEAN summit, big room, regional leaders, a lot of eyes on her. And what she's going to say? The Australian government has already released excerpts. They know exactly what they're doing here. It is a direct message to Beijing. Now, if you only caught the headlines today, you probably saw something like Australia warns China over provocative actions. And maybe you scrolled past it, right? Because you hear that phrase a lot these days. Provocative actions, regional stability. It all blends together. But this is not routine diplomacy. This is a line in the sand. And the way it's being delivered, the timing of it, the words they're choosing, it tells us something massive about what's happening in the Indo-Pacific right now. Let me break it down from the top. Australia's foreign minister is going to tell the room that Australia won't be intimidated. She's going to call out what she describes as provocative Chinese actions. And here's where it gets interesting. She's doing it in Manila, the Philippines, a country that's been in China's crosshairs over the South China Sea for years. The location matters more than people realize. Because here's what the networks aren't saying. Penny Wong could have made this statement in Canberra, could have put out a written press release, could have done a Zoom call. She chose to stand in front of Southeast Asian leaders in person and say it to their faces. That's a choice. Now, you have to understand the context here. Australia has been building up its military, deepening ties with the United States. The AUKUS deal, nuclear submarines, that whole thing. China has been watching, and they've made their displeasure very clear through their state media, through their diplomats, through their military exercises in waters that Australia considers its neighborhood. It's a classic great power struggle, but it's not a distant one anymore. It's happening right on Australia's doorstep. Let me walk you through the language the Australian government released. They say Wong will tell regional leaders that Australia will not be bullied. That's the word they're using. Bullied. Think about that for a second. That is a very specific emotional word. It's not, we express concern. It's not, we urge restraint. It's, we won't be bullied. Why would they choose such charged language? They know China's going to react. They know Beijing's going to call it interference, call it Western provocation, put out a statement condemning it. They did it anyway. And that tells me something. Australia's leadership has calculated that the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of speaking out. And when you have a country like Australia, which has historically tried to balance its economic relationship with China against its security relationship with the United States. When they start using language like bullied in an official diplomatic setting, that balance has shifted. Something fundamental changed. Now, I want you to think about the people in that room in Manila. You've got representatives from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, others. These are countries that live every single day in China's economic and military shadow. They're watching this exchange closely. And Penny Wong knows that. The ASEAN nations, they're the quiet ones in this drama. They don't often make headlines, but their leaders are among the most pragmatic on earth. They're not naive. They know exactly how much leverage China has over them. Trade, investment, tourism. And then there's the military dimension. The South China Sea, the Nine-Dash Line, disputed islands, fishing rights, energy resources. China's been pushing, and these countries have been managing. What Wong is doing, she's effectively telling them, Australia will stand with you. Australia sees what's happening. Australia is not going to back down. That's a massive diplomatic play. But here's the part that almost every news summary missed. The part I want you to really hear. Australia isn't just talking about the South China Sea. They're talking about China's nuclear arsenal. Yes, the statement mentions broader regional security concerns and military activities. But if you read between the lines, if you look at what Australia's been signaling for months now, this is about China's nuclear buildup. China is expanding its nuclear capabilities faster than anyone expected. And Australia, under the AUKUS deal, is going to have nuclear-powered submarines. Not nuclear weapons, but nuclear-powered. There's a distinction. But China doesn't make that distinction. To them, it's all nuclear. It's all a threat. So when Penny Wong stands up in Manila and says Australia won't be bullied, she's not just talking about a few Chinese ships in the South China Sea. She's talking about the entire security framework of the region, about who gets to patrol those waters, about whose subs are in whose ocean, about the balance of power between the United States, China, and everyone in between. And she knows exactly what she's doing. Let me give you a timeline here, because the timing is everything. Last month, Australia announced significant increases to its defense budget. Not small increases, big ones. Multi-billion-dollar spending. A shift in posture. A few weeks before that, there were reports of Chinese surveillance ships operating off the Australian coast. Wait, let me correct that. It was actually in the Timor Sea. That's the body of water between Australia and Indonesia. And the Chinese vessels weren't just passing through. They were there for an extended period, monitoring, showing presence. Australia didn't make a huge public scene about it at the time, but they remembered. And now, in Manila, they're bringing all of that into the room. You see how this works, right? It's not just one speech. It's a sequence, a buildup, a pattern of escalation that's been going on for years, but has accelerated in the last 12 months. I've been watching this region for a long time, and I can tell you the tone has shifted. The way Australia talks about China now is different from how they talked about China 5 years ago, 10 years ago. There used to be a lot of careful diplomatic language, lots of hedging, lots of "we value our relationship with China," followed by "but we have concerns." Not anymore. Now they're standing up in Manila and saying, "We won't be bullied." That is a direct challenge, and China is going to respond. You can almost write the script yourself. Beijing's foreign ministry will issue a statement. They'll say something about how China's activities are lawful and reasonable. They'll accuse Australia of, quote, hyping tensions and interfering in China's internal affairs. They might mention the AUKUS deal, call it confrontational. Maybe they'll say something about nuclear submarines in the region being destabilizing. And they're not wrong about that. But that's not the point. The point is who gets to define what's destabilizing? Who gets to say what's aggressive? Who gets to set the rules in the Indo-Pacific? That's what this is actually about. Now, I want to pause here and ask you a question, because I think it matters. Have you noticed how often China's actions in the South China Sea are described as provocative, but rarely called what they actually are? Occupation, coercion, land grabs. Because that's what's happening. China has been building artificial islands, installing military installations, claiming vast expanses of ocean that belong under international law to other nations. But the language we use matters. Provocative sounds like a game. It sounds like one kid poking another kid on the playground. But that's not what this is. This is about the future of the global order, about whether might makes right or whether international law actually means something. And Australia just put its flag in the ground. Now, the ASEAN leaders in that room, they're not going to cheer. They're not going to clap. That's not how this works. They'll nod. They'll express concern. They'll say they hope for dialogue and peaceful resolution. But privately, I guarantee you some of them are relieved because someone finally said it out loud. Someone finally stood up and said what they've been thinking for years but couldn't say themselves because they're too economically dependent on China, too geographically close, too vulnerable to retaliation. Australia has a little more room, a little more distance, a little more backing from Washington. So they said it. But don't think for a second that Australia's leaders are naive about the consequences. Penny Wong is smart. She's a lawyer. She's been in government for a long time. She knows that China's trade retaliation can be swift and brutal. Barley, wine, coal, education, tourism. Australia's economy has felt it before. She's doing this anyway. That should tell you how serious they view this situation. I'm going to take you back a little bit here to 2021. That's when Australia first really started clashing with China publicly. The then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, called for an investigation into the origins of COVID. China didn't like that. They slapped tariffs on Australian wine and barley, big ones. And then they just stopped responding to Australian diplomatic calls. The hotline went cold. It was a freeze, a punishment. Since then, the relationship has been icy. Not broken, but definitely not warm. Now, in 2026, Australia's moved into a new phase. They've got Labour government. Anthony Albanese is Prime Minister. They've tried to be a little more diplomatic, a little more careful. But the security situation has only gotten worse. China's military is bigger, more assertive. Their exercises in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, they're more frequent, more intense. And the U.S.? The U.S. is still the anchor of regional security. But there are questions, always questions, about American commitment, about American attention spans, about what happens if there's another crisis somewhere else, like Ukraine, and Washington's focus is pulled away. So Australia is stepping up, not because they want to be a global policeman, not because they're trying to start a war, but because they can't count on anyone else to do it for them. And they're telling that to the region in Manila. Let's go back to the speech itself, because I think the details matter. Wong is going to say that Australia will not be intimidated by provocative actions. But watch what she doesn't say. She doesn't say we're going to send more warships. She doesn't say we're preparing for conflict. She's not threatening anything. She's setting a boundary, a psychological boundary, and she's inviting other countries to stand behind it. That's diplomatic genius, actually, because by not threatening, she makes China's reaction look disproportionate. If Beijing responds with anger, with threats, with military posturing, who looks aggressive? Not Australia. Australia looks reasonable. China looks like what they are, a rising power that's still figuring out how to use its strength without frightening everyone around it. And that's a real challenge for Beijing. They've got all this capability, but they haven't figured out how to project it without creating a coalition of scared neighbors that runs toward Washington. It's the same problem Russia has, the same problem every power has when it grows too fast. You can't just be big. You have to be not scary. And China is scary right now. Now, the ASEAN nations. I want to talk about them for a minute because they're the real audience here. They have to live with China every day. Their economies are intertwined. Their seas are shared. Their security is complicated. And they've watched over the last decade as China claimed more, built more, took more. But they've also watched the U.S. push back. They've seen the Philippines file arbitration cases. They've seen the U.S. Navy sail through the South China Sea. They've seen Australia join in. And they've been trying so hard not to choose. Neutrality. That's been the ASEAN strategy. Stay neutral. Keep trading with everyone. Don't provoke anyone. Keep the peace. But neutrality is getting harder because China doesn't want neutral neighbors. They want aligned neighbors, friendly neighbors, neighbors who don't host American bases, who don't join AUKUS, who don't speak up at ASEAN summits about provocative actions. And that's the pressure Wang is addressing. She's saying you don't have to choose between us, but you do have to know that we're here, and we're not going anywhere, and we're not going to let China reshape the region through intimidation. That's a big message, and she's delivering it in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, a country that has its own deep, complicated relationship with China, a country that's been at the center of the South China Sea disputes for decades. The Philippines has its own claims, its own tensions, its own fears, and they're hosting this meeting. That's not accidental. Australia and the Philippines have been working closer together recently. Defense cooperation, intelligence sharing. The relationship has deepened. So when Wang speaks in Manila, she's speaking in friendly territory, on a platform that's been built in part by years of quiet diplomatic work between Canberra and Manila. This isn't a speech that came out of nowhere. It's the result of a long campaign. And now it's going public. Let me give you a sense of the scale here, because numbers matter. Australia's military budget in US dollars is about $55 billion. China's is approaching $300 billion. The US, for context, is over $800 billion. Australia is not trying to compete on size. They can't. That's not the game. The game is alliance building, capability integration, being a reliable partner to the US and to regional nations, being the kind of country that if trouble comes, can hold its own long enough for help to arrive. That's what the nuclear submarines are about, by the way. It's not about having nukes. It's about being able to stay in the fight, to project power, to show up. China knows that. They hate it, because it means Australia is becoming military. Not just a trading partner, not just a mining economy, a military power, aligned with the US, integrated with the US, capable of joint operations. That's a different Australia than the one China dealt with a decade ago. And the rhetoric is changing to match that. We won't be bullied. That's a quote from a country that used to say, "We hope for constructive dialogue." You see the shift? I'm not saying Australia's trying to start a war. Nobody wants that. But there's a new level of assertion here, a new willingness to speak clearly. And honestly, I think that's what the region needed. Because for years, China's been operating with a free hand, bit by bit, island by island, kilometer by kilometer, and nobody was saying stop. Now someone is. But here's the uncomfortable part, and I gotta be real with you. China's not going to stop just because Australia says something. They've got their own strategic imperatives, their own sense of national destiny, their own view of history that says the South China Sea belongs to them, has always belonged to them. That's not true under international law, but that's how they see it, and they're not going to be talked out of it by a speech. So what does Wang's speech actually achieve? It frames the issue. It puts it on record. It signals to other countries that Australia is a reliable partner who will speak up. And maybe, just maybe, it makes China think twice before the next provocative action. Because now they know Australia will call them out publicly in front of everyone. That changes the cost-benefit calculation, at least a little. I want to talk about what happens next now, because the speech is the beginning, not the end. China will respond, probably within 24 hours. They'll issue a statement. They'll condemn Australia's interference. They'll accuse the U.S. of stoking tensions. They'll say the South China Sea is not a place for outside powers. And the ASEAN countries will issue their own careful, measured statements. We urge all parties to exercise restraint. Dialogue is the only path forward. We remain committed to peace and stability. The same words we've been hearing for years. But this time, they'll mean something different. Because this time, someone on their side said something blunt. And the silence from the other ASEAN nations, the fact that they're not criticizing Australia, that silence is a message in itself. In diplomacy, what's not said is sometimes louder than what is. Let me go a little deeper on that. Indonesia, the largest country in ASEAN, huge economy, huge population. Historically, they've been very careful about China. They've got their own disputes in the South China Sea. They've got their own concerns, but they haven't spoken out like Australia just did. Why not? Because they're not ready. Or maybe because they want to see what happens when someone else takes the lead. They want to watch the reaction. They want to see if China retaliates, if Australia survives it, if the U.S. backs Australia up. Then they'll decide what to do. That's the game. Everyone's waiting for someone else to go first. Australia just went first. And that takes guts, because there's a real risk here. Trade retaliation is the most immediate threat. But there's also the risk of military miscalculation. One ship gets too close. One plane flies too low. One radio call gets misinterpreted. And suddenly, you've got an incident, a standoff, something that escalates faster than anyone planned. That's the fear. That's what keeps diplomats up at night. But the alternative is letting China keep taking. and that's worse. So Penny Wong is going to Manila. She's going to stand at that podium. She's going to say what she's going to say. And then she's going to wait, along with everyone else. I mentioned AUKUS earlier, and I want to circle back to that because it's central to all of this. AUKUS is the defense pact between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, signed in 2021. Nuclear submarines are the centerpiece of it. Australian crews, American nuclear technology, British design. It's a massive industrial project that will reshape Australia's defense posture for a generation. China hates it. They really, really hate it because it brings the U.S. Navy's capabilities into Australia's fleet. It makes Australia a nuclear-capable nation, even if they're not carrying nukes. It integrates Australian defense planning with American and British planning in a way that's never happened before. And it's happening right in the neighborhood. The Manila speech is AUKUS in action. Not the submarines themselves, but the political will behind them. The willingness to stand with allies. The willingness to say, we're not afraid. Wong is essentially telling China, we've got the subs, we've got the US, we've got the UK, and we're not backing down. Now, she's not saying that out loud. She's too diplomatic for that. But that's the subtext. And everyone in that room will understand it. So, where does this leave us? The Indo-Pacific is entering a new phase of competition, a more open phase, more direct, more adversarial. Australia just drew a line. China will test it. And we'll see very quickly whether that line holds. Whether it's just words or whether it's backed by real willingness to act. I don't know the answer to that. Nobody does. But I do know that the era of quiet diplomacy, of gentle nudges, of we hope you will reconsider, that era is over. Penny Wong is about to make that clear to the entire region. And in a few hours, when Beijing responds, the world will see exactly how far this thing is going to go. I'm going to be watching very closely. You should too. Because this is one of those moments. You don't always know it when it's happening. But this is one of those moments. The kind that gets written about in history books. A country that's been a quiet player for decades just stood up and said something everybody heard. The question now is, who will stand with them? Think about that for a second, because their answer tells you everything about how the next 5 years are going to go. I hope you got something from this breakdown. I tried to walk you through it the way I see it, not the headlines, the real movement underneath them. And if you've been following this situation, if you've been watching China's moves in the South China Sea, watching Australia's buildup, watching the U.S. realign its Pacific strategy, you know exactly what's at stake here. This is not a small thing. So I'll leave you with this. The speech is coming. The reaction is coming. And then we'll see what happens next. but something tells me this is just the beginning. Thanks for sticking around through this. I know it was a long one, but these are the conversations that matter, and I don't think we should look away just because it's complicated. If you want to keep following this with me, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be tracking everything that happens after this speech drops. The Chinese response, the ASEAN statements, the market moves, all of it. And I'll see you in the next one.